And so many times writing this Master Craftsman, I just felt so inadequate. I kept telling my husband, I don't know if I'm clever enough to write this story. I don't know if I can write, these little clues and twists and turns, and I just so many times felt like I wasn't doing the story justice. But you just got to keep fighting and power through. And in the end, I think it came together really beautifully, and I ended up really loving it.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to my podcast. I'm so excited to have you here with me today because we are going to listen to award-winning author Kelli Stuart talk about her new book coming out next year, The Master Craftsman. So welcome, Kelli, to my podcast.
Thank you so much.
Well, why don't you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and your writing journey, because I always find that most of my listeners and myself, we are really encouraged and inspired when we listen to award-winning authors tell us about how they became award-winning published authors. And then after that, we'll talk about this fascinating book, The Master Craftsman.
Sure, I would love to. So I actually, I went to Baylor, and I started out at Baylor as a musical theater major. I was going to head off to Broadway and quickly realized that that was not what I was going to do. And so I started sort of just searching. I've always been a storyteller, and I loved telling stories. And I got a little sidetracked here and there trying to figure out what I wanted to study. But I was in a writing class, and I wrote a paper about the tragedy at Chernobyl. And I was also a Russian minor. I'd been to Ukraine and Russia in high school and just really loved that area of the world. So my teacher pulled me aside and said, hey, your paper was really well written. I just want to let you know I submitted it to a writing conference or a contest, and they won. And said, have you considered our professional writing major? It's a new major. And so I ended up majoring in professional writing, and just fell in love with the art of storytelling. And through that, my last year at Baylor, I was taking a class where our only assignment for the entire year, it was a 2-semester course, was to write a novel.
Wow.
And when I had been living in Ukraine, I had met a woman who had survived a Nazi slave labor camp. And so I decided to fictionalize her story for that class. And at the end of that year, my professor pulled me aside and he said, I really think you're onto something. I think you should keep pursuing this. And that was the first time I'd ever really considered writing as a true career. I always thought it would just be like a cute little hobby. Mm-hmm. So I graduated and immediately found work as a co-author with Joe White. He runs Kanakuk camps in Missouri, and it's a Christian sports camp. And he hired me to be his co-author for a devotional that he was writing for parents and teens. And then I started doing some ghostwriting and some editing, but I just always had this story of this woman who survived this slave labor camp in the back of my brain. So in 2003, I started picking that story up again. And I had a friend who was a teacher in Ukraine, and she asked her students to all interview their grandparents and get their stories from the war. And so I started kind of getting all these true stories. And in 2003, I went to Ukraine and I just toured the country and spoke with veterans and got all their true stories. And, long story short, at the time I was pregnant with my first child, and I had 3 babies in quick succession. And so it took about 10 years to finish that novel. So wow. I finally finished that book in 2013 and got an agent in 2015. And it was published in 2016 and went on to win the Carroll Award for Best Historical Fiction, and was nominated for the Christie. So that book was called Like a River from Its Course and was my first novel. And that just sort of set me on the path. And my second novel was called A Silver Willow by the Shore. And it's a generational tale of 3 women, a grandmother who survived a Nazi or a Soviet gulag, and her daughter and her granddaughter, and how those events shaped all of them. And And then my third novel released this past summer, and then my fourth novel is releasing next year. So it's just been one after the other since 2016, but that very first novel took 10 years. So I was in it for the long game.
And that's the part that really encourages us to keep going, because so many times the authors I meet, the writers I meet, they're wanting to give up. But
Right.
I love pointing them to my podcast interviews with authors, because each story is so unique, but always inspiring. And that's just amazing. Now, this course that you took where you had to write a novel, did you have to turn it in like piecemeal, or just one at the very end, you just had to turn in the rough draft?
Yeah, every Monday we would meet. There were 6 of us in the class, and every Monday we would meet at a coffee shop, and we had to have 10 pages written.
Okay.
And we had to hand our pages to the person sitting next to the right. And we had to read one another's work and give constructive criticism. So it taught us how to do some editing. It taught us how to take and give constructive criticism. And so it was really kind of a magical class that I took.
That's fantastic. And then with this story, the fictionalized story of a true event, did you have to get permission from the person that you wrote it about?
No, because I fictionalized it enough. So no, I didn't have to worry about that. I took bits and pieces of all the stories that I heard and kind of made this overall composite.
Oh, I love that. Wow, that is just amazing. And you got to go to the Ukraine and do real research, that not just book research or internet research. I mean, you were there.
Yeah, it was really cool.
That's
and
like
I mean, it was a great concept, but even still, it faced a lot of rejection. I mean, I think I counted that I got 63 rejection letters before I finally got that one yes. So it just goes to show that even a really good idea can face all the same rejection, and you just have to be persistent and tenacious and keep fighting.
That's true. Did they ever give you some reasons as to why they didn't want to publish it? Was it the subject matter, or?
Some of it was sort of the time. At that time, nonfiction was beginning to take off, and fiction was kind of going by the wayside a little bit. And that was one thing I kept hearing was fiction is a tough sell right now. Fiction is a tough sell.
Who would have thought?
My first draft was very long. And so some of it was I just had to do some work to make it a reasonable length so that people would be willing to pick up a manuscript from an unknown author. So it was a combination of things.
So yeah, you had to be persistent and never give up on the dream and believing in your story, because that is one amazing story.
Yeah.
Now, World War II history is one of my most favorite subjects. So Ukrainian during World War II, that's just amazing. I'm gonna have to read that book. And I like to interview Holocaust survivors. I have several that I've interviewed over the years, and I have an idea of kind of combining their stories into making one. So I'm very inspired by that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about this book, The Master Craftsman. Yeah. I just love Russian history, only because it's, I grew up watching Dr. Zhivago with my mom. She and I would sit in front of the TV whenever it was on and watch it. My dad would roll his eyes and say, "Oh my gosh, you've seen this 1,000 times." And I think for me, I was just so intrigued by the romance of the Russian people. They loved poetry and beauty and everything. And so that just kind of gripped me. And then with the contrast of the horrific events of the Russian Revolution, you see such a contrast between the beauty and the persistence and the romance of the Russian people, and then the horrors of that time. And as an artist, I've had to study the realist period during that time that Lenin ushered in. So the poor artists weren't able to be expressive anymore. They had to paint only what he said they could paint. And so I just love diving into that Russian history. So tell us a little bit about how you were inspired to write this book about the classic Fabergé, the House of Fabergé and the Fabergé eggs.
Well, it's interesting. I obviously am fascinated with Russian history as well. And, I studied the language, and so I just find myself always coming back to Russia and Ukraine and to the stories that come out of there. And so a couple of years ago, I was kind of batting around some ideas for my next book. I was in the middle of a book, but I wasn't feeling super passionate about it. And one day, I can't remember even how I stumbled upon the article. I think it was like on Facebook or something, but I clicked on a link. And the article was about a crown that someone in England wore in a wedding or something like that. And it was like an old Russian princess crown. And so that's why I clicked on it. But then buried at the bottom of the article was a story of a man in America who in 2000, I believe it was 2013 or 2011, I'm not quite sure the date, but he was a scrap metal dealer, and at an auction he bought what he thought was just just some scrap metal. He was going to melt it down and sell it, and as he started cleaning it, he realized that he had something much more valuable, and he had one of the missing Fabergé imperial Easter eggs. He had the Moscow Kremlin egg. Wow. And he ended up selling it to a museum in London for multiple millions of dollars. Wow. And I was just fascinated by this story. Yeah, so I started doing some research and found that Fabergé created 52 eggs for the imperial family from 1889 to 1917 or 1916, I think was the last one he made. And but to date, only 41 of those 52 eggs have been found. Wow. So many of them just disappeared during the Russian Revolution. So that just, as an author, you get these questions in your head. And I thought, well, what happened to the other eggs? Where are they? And so it just kind of set me on this trail of like, what if I wrote a story about a treasure hunt looking for a missing egg? But I didn't want it to be too realistic because there are all these missing eggs. There's 11 missing eggs still. And I was like, well, I don't want to pretend that I know where any of those are. So
yeah.
So in my novel, in my fictionalized story, Fabergé created a mystery 53rd egg. And so my characters, it's a split time. And so my characters in present day are searching for this mystery 53rd egg. And then you're kind of going back and forth between Fabergé and his world and his life and the creation and the treasure hunt. And it was really fun. It was something a little bit different. And I just really loved writing it.
Oh, it sounds amazing. So it is one of those time split novels?
Yes.
Okay, great. What made you want to do it that way instead of just having it about Alma in 1917?
I thought it was going to be more interesting for it to be a treasure hunt. And that was the other thing. And as I started researching Fabergé, I realized he was so ahead of his time in that he employed women and he even elevated them to the status of master craftsmen within his company. And Alma Pill was known to be one of his most creative master craftsmen. And so I thought, well, what a wonderful story. She created two of the most revered eggs, the winter egg and the mosaic egg. And so I wanted to tell her story, but I wanted there to be a little more intrigue than just telling the story of Fabergé. So in order to make it a treasure hunt, I felt like we needed a little bit of split time.
That's great. And what made you, how did you go about even starting this kind of research?
Oh, yeah. Well, the way that I kind of do research is I do a lot of reading on the front end. And then once I feel like I've kind of exhausted my reading and I feel like my fingers starting to itch to write, I'll put the research aside and, I take a lot of notes and I'll just start writing. And I try really hard not to get caught up in the small details on that first draft. I try to just punch it out as quickly as I can. And then as I'm going through and rereading, I'll go in and fill in the little details like, what their clothing looked like and what the descriptions of buildings and that sort of thing. But I just do a lot of reading on the front end. And I found some really fascinating books on Fabergé. In fact, I was actually on a trip to London in 2019, and I was just kind of putzing around a bookstore in London. I mean, it was as romantic as it sounds, just popping into a bookstore in London, and I found this book on Fabergé and the eggs, and that became like my number one research book. There was a ton of great information in it. So yeah, I just love to read, and then I find all the little details later and pepper them in.
So you're not the first historical fiction author who has told me that. When I interviewed Jane Kirkpatrick, she said the same thing, that she does so much research, and it's tempting as she's writing her story to put in all the little tiny things, like the general who said this and his
Mhm.
secretary and this, that, and then she has to stop herself, kind of like what you said, and just write the story first. And, because the reader, sometimes that can be too distracting when too much information is put
Right.
in a section because we're so caught up in this amazing story. And so that's really wise. That's excellent advice for those of us who might be attempting some sort of novel where we have to do extensive research. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
Do
And if
you?
you get too caught up in it, you never finish the story.
Mm.
And so the idea is to get through that really rough first draft, the hard first draft, and then go in and fix what needs to be fixed.
Hmm. Do you have like a group of beta readers that read it for you, or do you just go straight to the editor at your publisher?
I have one friend who is my go-to person who
Mm.
I really don't let anyone see anything I've written until she reads it first, because she's just brilliant and has such a great eye for detail. And so I trust her. And so she's always the one that reads it first and helps me work out major kinks.
Did you, after that one course that you took, did you ever rely on critique groups after that again, or?
I haven't. I've always thought about how it would be fun to have a critique group. When I was writing my first novel, when I was writing like a River Ferment's course, and when the book was really starting to kind of take off, probably the last few years that I was working on it, I did have a group of friends, and every summer for a week we would get together and just do a creative retreat. And I was the only fiction writer, but there was a fiction writer, there were a couple photographers, a nonfiction writer, and a teacher. And we all just had projects that we were working on, and we'd come together and work on them. And then in the evenings, we'd share with one another what we'd done that day. And so they kind of became my critique group for that particular book. And it was always so nice to have that to bounce ideas off of.
Yeah, I like that. I have never really been a part of one before, but I have interviewed a few authors who were, and then many who were just said, no, I just send it to my editor at my publisher, and we go back and forth, and she helps me out. So I wasn't sure if you were one or the other, but yeah, that's fascinating. That's great to have that one person that you can trust with your rough draft, right?
Yes.
That's
Yes, and
amazing.
she'll give it to me straight, she doesn't sugarcoat
Mm-hmm.
anything, and which I just appreciate, because I'd rather hear it from her than, get a painful rejection or something.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, speaking of rejection, for the authors out there listening, especially like myself too, where we have been rejected, how did you or how do you handle when you are rejected or when you've encountered failure? What advice could you give to someone who is there at that moment?
You just have to believe in what you're doing. You have to really believe in your story, and you have to take constructive criticism. I know for my second novel, as I was pitching it around, I would get the form rejections from different agents. And one of the agents, she sent me a little bit more of a personalized email. So it made me feel comfortable to reply to her. And I just responded and I said, I appreciate that you taking the time to read it. Do you have any feedback for me? And she gave me some excellent feedback of, this is what held me back from picking this up, and this is what I think you need to work on to make this a stronger manuscript. And I took her advice and I really put the work in. And so you have to believe in your story and believe your story is worth it, but you also have to believe that if people are rejecting it for a reason, see if you can find out why, and if you can fix it, and work on it. So be humble, but be confident.
Mm, excellent advice. And another thing that I was wondering as I was preparing for today, Where do you get your ideas? I know you studied Russian history and you were involved with your research and interviews with the Ukraine, but where do you get your ideas to draft these stories?
They sort of just come to me really randomly. Like, I mean, like a river from its course, that one just sort of fell in my lap. And that I met this woman while I was in Ukraine. And my second book, I was just doing a lot of reading because Like a River had come out and I felt like I didn't have any more ideas. And so my agent at the time just encouraged me to start reading. And there was just one like short line in a book that I was reading that stood out to me, and that became sort of the backbone of my second novel. And my third novel is a turn of the century circus novel. And I just happened to go, I live here in Tampa, Florida, and down in Sarasota is the Ringling Brothers Museum.
Mm.
And I was walking around the Ringling Brothers Museum one day and just got this idea for a book. And same with the Fabergé, I was just reading a news article that was kind of random. So sometimes they just come with me. And when you kind of feel that spark, and also like I just kind of have figured out when I feel that spark, and when it's an idea that feels too hard and that scares me, that's probably what I need to write up.
Something that
So
challenges you and
yeah,
stretches you, right? Yeah,
exactly.
I hear you. I'm such a chicken though. I'm still writing the easy stuff. I know I have a World War II historical fiction novel in me,
Hmm.
but I'm just such a chicken yet. I haven't really gone into it yet. But yeah, that's awesome that you are willing to stretch yourself. That's how you grow, though. I mean,
Yeah,
if we never stretch ourselves, if we
it
never
is.
go
And
against that resistance, right, we're not going to grow
right.
as writers.
And so many times writing this master craftsman, I just felt so inadequate. Like I kept telling my husband, I don't know if I'm clever enough to write this story. I don't know if I can write, these little clues and twists and turns, and I just so many times felt like I wasn't doing the story justice. But you just got to keep fighting and power through. And in the end, I think it came together really beautifully, and I ended up really loving it.
Wonderful. So you brought up your husband, you brought up family. With 5 kids, when do you find the time to write? And is your family pretty understanding about this career that you have?
Yes, they're very gracious. Um, I have I have a wide age range. So I have, my youngest is 6, my oldest is 18. So my older three, they've always known mom gets up early and works, and on and off. I've homeschooled kids here and there. And so this year actually is the first time I've ever, all 5 of my kids are in school full time. And it's been like amazing. And yet I still can't seem to find time to write. But I found that I work really well early in the morning. And so I would always just get up around 4:30 or 5, and I would put in an hour before everybody woke up. And then my husband is super gracious, and he knows that writing is just really life-giving to me, and it's my passion. And so he'll a couple times a year just let me go get a hotel nearby, and I'll hole up for 48 hours, and I'll write a bunch of words. And so I don't know, I just piecemeal the time together to where it works. I wouldn't say I'm prolific, but it's the season that I'm in, and it works.
About how many books do you write a year?
Um, well, it's hard to say because I start and stop sometimes. So like the book that I released this past summer, I actually started that before I got the idea for Master Craftsman. And then I got so excited about Master Craftsman that I put that one aside. I wrote Master Craftsman, and then I went back to that one. So I
Mhm.
kind of wrote the two of those in tandem. But then like this year, I haven't written anything because I've just been busy editing and promoting. And so I have a couple of ideas, and 2022 I plan to start writing again. So at this point, I'm kind of at a place where I can write a first draft in about 10 months.
Nice. Well, I admire your passion, and that's great that you have a supportive family, a support
Mhm.
system. That's great. Well,
Yes, it
Kelly
is.
Stewart, I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us about your fascinating writing journey, your passion and love of research and the Russian history, which is something I adore too. My husband worked on the animated film Anastasia,
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, a long time ago. 1997 was when it released. And while he was working on the movie for those 2 years, I was able to tour the studio and look at all the drawings and sketches. And that just really ignited the passion in me again. So I started reading a whole bunch of books about Anastasia.
Yeah. Have you read Ariel Lawhon's book, I Was Anastasia?
No, huh?
Oh, you should read it. You would love it.
Okay, I'll read that. Yeah, that's just a story that fascinates me. I mean, I know she's gone and everything, but it is such an incredible story that has spawned so many historical fiction movies and novels and Broadway plays and everything. So, yeah, so when I saw that your book was about that, I thought, "Oh, I've got to talk to Kelli Stuart." Well, I appreciate you taking the time, and I wish you nothing but the best of success for 2022 when The Master Craftsman is released. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.